Everybody. My name's Beth. I'm one of the radiology ST2s here in Norwich. So I'm going to go through a little bit on how the radiology training program works. I'll try and make it applicable for those of you who are interested in radiology and those who will be applying for other pathways as well. Hopefully it will be relevant for you all. So I did my F1 and F2 and then did 1 year of GP training and then transferred into radiology. I realized quite quickly that I preferred being. So this is how the structure of radiology training works. So it's a run through program from ST1 through to ST5. Which means that you roughly know which location you will be in for the full 5 years of your training. There's an extra 1 year if you decide to subspecialize in intervention radiology. So that brings it up to at least 6 years if you want to do an IR specific pathway. And we'll go through a little bit about what each of the years and different blocks involve a little bit further on in the talk. I think it's important to be aware that it is run through, which I think is a benefit for most people, that you have the certainty that you know where you'll be for the next 5 years. But you also want to try and make sure that whichever program you find yourself in, that you're happy being there for 5 years, because you can apply for interdeanery transfers, but they can be a slightly longer process. So you want to try and make sure that you're happy where you go for your training program. And some people will be more flexible in where they can go than other people. So definitely think about that in advance. So from ST1 to ST3 in radiology training is when you basically learn all of the basics of radiology. So you'll spend a fair bit of your time doing X-ray and ultrasound, but you will also start doing cross-sectional imaging, so CT and MR. From ST1 to ST3, the way that it works here in Norwich is that you do 3 monthly module rotations. So some of those examples would be chest, GI, and neuro. So you do 3 months of each of those and rotate round until you've done most of the main subspecialties, which you'll finish by the end of your ST3 year. As you begin in your ST1, you'll be relatively well supervised, and you become a little bit more independent towards your ST3 year when your on calls start. So for most people, they'll begin overnight on calls in ST3, and they'll do sort of independent CT reporting, which is then reviewed by one of the radiology consultants the next day. So you have to be confident in issuing your own CT reports by ST3. So in ST1, initially when you go in, it's a very steep learning curve. So you go from knowing relatively what you're doing on the ward and how things work and being able to make relatively confident diagnoses to feeling like you don't know a lot again. So in some ways you feel like you're taking 2 steps back, which can be challenging. But in Norwich, because it's an academy system, you get intensive academy-based teaching for 4 months. So that helps kind of make that transition into radiology training. So it's quite teaching heavy, especially at an academy. And you'll begin to do supervised X-ray reporting and also supervised ultrasound as well. And during your ST1 year, you'll prepare for your Part 1 exam, which involves anatomy and physics. So then when you go on to ST4 and 5, this is when you start thinking about subspecialty training. So you can pick 1 or 2 subspecialties depending on what your interests are, and you'll begin to think about whether or not you want to do a diagnostic radiology pathway, or whether or not IR is something that you want to do a subspecialty program in. Or you can certainly do diagnostic radiology, but still do some interventional procedures or biopsies. So there's lots of flexibility in terms of trying to plan the type of career pathway that you want to do. It's about this time people start thinking about whether or not they might want to do a fellowship post their CCT. So often what people do is to try and gain a little bit more experience before they get a consultant post. They might take up a fellowship post either in the same region that they've trained, but also you can go to other regions or other countries. So trainees here have gone to Canada and Australia before to do fellowship programs. And people start thinking about where they want to be for their consultant post later in their career. So do they want to become much more subspecialized and do more subspecialization work, or do you want to keep things general and work in more of a DGH type environment? So exams in radiology, so I've already mentioned the part one that you do during your ST1. So that's the first exam that you have to sit. That entails an anatomy paper and a physics paper. The FRCR part two then comes in about November of your ST3 year. And then after that, you've got your part 2B, which is your final radiology exam, and that's generally about October of ST4. So part one, as I've said, is anatomy and physics. That's generally in about March of your first year. Most people start more intensive revision at about Christmas of ST1. The part 2A is the notoriously difficult exam. It's a single best answer examination on all subspecialty topics. So there's an awful lot to learn. It's considered to be one of the most difficult postgraduate medical exams. So it is a tricky one. And depending on whether or not you're full time, most people will take that exam around November of their ST3 year. But the pass rate is in and around sort of 50 to 60%. So it is a possibility that you would have to take it more than once. Your 2B exam is then the final exam, and it consists of a Viva style exam and also a rapid reporting. And that's usually in about the October of ST4. So here in Norwich, we have the East of England Imaging Academy. So that's where we are now. And that makes up one of 5 academies across the UK. The other academies are in Plymouth, Leeds, Wales, and then there's also Northern Deanery that encompasses the northeast and also Cumbria. So with these academies, you get more intensive sort of teaching at first. And the year groups tend to be a little bit bigger as well. So as I've said, the academy, you'll get probably more lecture and tutorial based teaching initially. The year groups tend to be a little bit bigger, especially in recent years, because there's a need to train more radiology trainees and have more consultants coming through. And generally you get very good learning resources and good exam preparation. So we got a lot of formal physics teaching that was really helpful for part one. And as I said, it does help to make that transition into radiology teaching, and you have a little bit less responsibility initially, simply just because you have a bit more teaching. In traditional programs, you might spend a bit more time in the hospital initially with more on-call exposure, and you'll probably start with shadowing to try and get your knowledge kind of up to speed before you start doing on-calls. Obviously, that depends where you are. There are also hybrid systems. So, for example, in Leicester, where you spend part of your time in the academy and part of your time in the department as well. So it depends where you want to be. So generally, I'll go through some good resources that I think are useful for both radiology, but also applications in general. So this book is extremely useful for anybody who anticipates that they might have an interview for subspecialty training. I find that really, really useful. So I definitely recommend that book. In terms of non-radiology training, whatever you're applying for, try and be familiar with Oriel. from the beginning. Don't leave it until 2 days before the application to go through, because it can take a bit of time just to put your personal details into the system. So try and get familiar with that early. It's relatively self-explanatory, but it's good just to make sure that you have all the easy bits per se in early. Also, get up to speed and try and familiarize yourself with the person specification. If it's radiology, look at the radiology one. If it's something else, have a look through, because it's a great basis of the kinds of things that you want to try and be demonstrating on your, either in the interview or in your application process. So it can help you kind of structure your answers and give you an idea about the kinds of things that you want to try and demonstrate to those who are sort of judging your application. Radiology Cafe and Radcast are really, really useful radiology resources. So if you're thinking about radiology, definitely check those two websites out. And for those of you who might be applying for radiology this year, our academy, East of England Imaging Academy, run an interview course, which may be really helpful. It's some of the consultants who give up their time to do formal interviews, which mirror the kinds of interviews that they will do for the application process. So that gives you some really helpful practice in front of the consultants for interview preparation. And I would say generally, for whatever you're applying to, don't underestimate the importance of trying to practice in front of somebody, because it can be really, really helpful. And other things that I would recommend as well, just think about what things that you have to demonstrate on your application. So for example, if you've done an audit, do you have evidence or a certificate to show what you've done? And if you don't, try and get those early. Don't be leaving it to the last minute where you risk not being able to get the points just because you don't have a certificate of something. Or if, for example, you had a society position in university, go back early to try and get the evidence. Don't be trying to run around at the last minute. So I think that's most of my talk. More than happy to take any questions. I would say in general, don't let competition ratios put you off applying. I nearly didn't apply to radiology because I just didn't think that I would ever get a place in Norwich. So don't let that put you off. If you know it's what you want to do, apply, because if you don't apply, you know that you won't get a post. And my other tip would be, don't put yourself in a position, if you know that you don't want to be in a specific location, don't rank it. Don't put yourself in a position where you have to reject something that you knew you already didn't want. So rank what you genuinely want. And if you know that you can't or won't move, then don't rank it, because it just makes your life more difficult further on if you know that you're not going to be able to do that. Yeah, so I've got a few questions that I'll work through. So the first one is, what exam do you do after F2 or from GP to radiology switch? So the answer to that is that you resit the MSRA. So every year you apply and you have to resit. So I basically did the MSRA again, and thankfully got shortlisted for interview. So you can't, it's not an exam where you can roll your mark over from the year before, and you have to resit the exam. And the second question, just out of curiosity, why did you switch from GP to radiology? So initially, when I was doing my F2 applications, I thought radiology wouldn't have enough patient contact for me, which was wrong. I did a bit more time researching, spent a bit of time within the departments, and realised quite quickly that I really enjoyed being in the hospital environment and got much more of a buzz out of that rather than being in the community. So that was one of the reasons that I switched from GP to radiology. So for me, that was definitely the right decision. Is it possible, the next question, is it possible to take a career break to travel during radiology training? If so, at what point? So I think that's really dependent on your TPD. So there have been trainees who have done that within our training program, but it would be a conversation that you would have to have between yourself and the TPD. So I can't say that it would definitely be possible, but if it is something that you think you would get benefit out of, and then you can always have discussions with TPDs about whether or not that might be possible during your training. Any other questions at all? No, more than happy to, if anyone has a question they don't want to put in the chat box, more than happy to have an email, but I'll hand you back over to Phil for the moment. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Beth. That was really informative. Another thing, Reddit is also a really good resource. Don't laugh. But for example, if you finding out what the different training schemes are like can be a bit difficult. So when you're thinking about where to apply, what the different, so for example, some places, I think kind of like Charing Cross, Imperial Trust, you're on nights in ST1, for example. Reddit, just finding word of mouth from different trainees. There are some good threads there about what different places do. Really good point Beth made about not ranking things that you wouldn't take. So, for instance, another thing that's can be difficult to find is what kind of hospitals each training program includes. And Oriel does mention it a bit, but also if you go on the individual trusts or training programs website, they usually list them. And for me, I don't drive for medical reasons, so I had to be strategic. So, for instance, like Severn, Devon, Cornwall, you move around kind of, I think, every other month or something. Wales, things are quite spread out, and certain deaneries in Scotland, things are quite spread out. So I couldn't feasibly have gone to those places because I couldn't get around. So I just didn't rank them. So yeah, important things to think about, and Reddit and Radiology Cafe as well are good resources for that. Our interview course is Tuesday, the 23rd of January. We'll advertise again closer to the time, but yeah, it'll be kind of an afternoon one-on-one consultant and some reg interviews as well with feedback, and we'll go through your portfolio, and there'll also be most likely a poster competition with a prize. So if any of you have done any research, then you can present that there. So I will hand you over to Louis, Dr. Sada, for probably what is most important to a lot of you is how the interview works and how the application process works.